Welcome to Embargoed, intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I'm your host, Tim O'Toole, and with me today, again for his at least second appearance on Embargoed, is Collmann Griffin. Collmann, welcome back to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
So today, we're going to talk about, we're going to go to our crystal ball. And we're going to try and talk about what we see coming up in the next couple of months in sanctions. And we're going to go around the world from country to country and region to region to talk about a little bit about what we're seeing, but basically how that informs what's to come. Before we do, anything you wanted to talk about, Collmann, in terms of speaking appearances or friends and that you wanted to give a shout out to? Just anything that comes to the top of your mind.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I do want to give a shout out. As I said on the last episode, I'm a USG OFAC and BIS alumnus, and so I want to give a shout out today to listeners of the pod in the U.S. government. We love that you listen. We hope we don't get stuff wrong. Please let us know if we do. And an open invitation. We love talking to all sorts of different folks. And so if anybody in the USG wants to come on and speak with us, please reach out. You know where to find us.
Absolutely. Easy to find us online or wherever you get your podcasts. And that is one of the things, Collmann, that always makes me a little nervous when we're talking on this, is that we know we do have a lot of U.S. government listeners, and we really appreciate all the support, but also we talk about things they're doing, and I do worry that we'll get stuff wrong since, we're not in the room where it happens. But we try.
Thus far, I've heard no complaints.
Good. That's good to know. That's good to know. Well, why don't we turn a little bit to Russia, because that's probably been in the news more than anything else. And I'm going to throw it over to you to talk about, where we think we're headed with sanctions. But I know that the president has been making a lot of statements about Russia within the last few days, both in terms of sanctions. But why don't we also talk a little bit about what this new concept that I hadn't really heard much before the last few months of secondary tariffs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's kind of surprising to say this, but I think all signs point to sanctions at this point. We're hearing stuff from the president. We're going to put on sanctions. We've heard the president describe Russia's actions as "quote unquote" disgusting, which is an interesting turn of phrase. And so I do think we're going to get some sanctions on Russia, probably in maybe even within a week. I've been kind of thinking through what we can predict, what we might see. There's a lot of discussion of tariffs, which is interesting. There's the sort of traditional tariffs where we put tariffs on Russian origin goods. I guess we could call those primary tariffs, to borrow from.
And we've had that for a while, or at least we've had like prohibitions, so even worse than tariffs in terms of imports.
Exactly. So I don't think that there's a lot of leverage there. Most of the Russian hydrocarbons have been Russian origin hydrocarbons have been prohibited since the beginning of the war, so not much there. Maybe a little bit in uranium. So we've sort of started the process of banning Russian origin uranium, but due to our supply chain dependencies in the United States, I understand that we're still licensing imports of uranium. So a tariff there could have some impact, but uranium is sort of small potatoes for Russian revenue compared to oil and natural gas. But then there's sort of the more novel concept of secondary tariffs, where we impose tariffs on goods originating in countries that are still buying Russian hydrocarbons and uranium.
Yeah, I mean, this concept is one that certainly I'd never heard anything about it before. I mean, there's secondary sanctions, which we know quite a lot about. But secondary tariffs seems relatively novel, but it seems like already in some of the Liberation Day tariffs, particularly the one against India, that this concept is already being not only just developed, but potentially implemented.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Which I admit will surprise me a little bit. So the big buyers of Russian hydrocarbons and uranium are China, India, Turkey, Brazil, still a little bit of EU. Uh, whether these sort of natural gas dependencies, Hungary, Belgium, France, Slovakia, Netherlands. Um, but so none of those, to me at least, would be an appealing tariff target. There's a trade negotiations ongoing between China and India. Um, I guess Brazil, they're happy to put tariffs on, but that's much less of a buyer. But then we did see this truth on July 30th, where Donald Trump mentions a 25% tariff plus a penalty for the Russian oil, which is interesting. It's below the 500% that was in the Senate bill and S 1241, but it is more than zero. So we'll have to watch that space. That'll be very interesting.
Yeah, and the I think, India and its refining of Russian oil has been a big media issue for 2 or 3 years. It's not subject to sanctions because it's not considered Russian oil under just traditional substantial transformation trade law principles, and so that's, at least so far, has been kind of outside of the realm of sanctions. But for the price cap, I mean, the price cap would still apply to the purchases of this oil from Russia, but the once it's bought in India and then refined, it hasn't been treated as Russian oil, but now it would be treated as kind of the subject of a potential secondary tariff, which would essentially
Yeah.
take back this substantial transformation concept. So I guess we'll watch that.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, that's also we might want to get into this, Tim. That's kind of a segue into sort of more traditional sanctions measures that we could see in addition to the secondary tariffs. If you think our listeners would be,
let's talk about that.
So sort of number one on the sort of traditional sanctions moves would be cracking down on oil purchases in sort of more traditional ways. There's been sort of hesitation to do that because of the major role that Russia plays in world energy markets and the potential impacts on energy prices around the world. But we could see sort of removal of the price cap mechanism and just treating Russian oil the same way we treat Iranian or Venezuelan oil. Just any purchases of Russian origin oil are prohibited, and just full stop, crackdown SDN listings for the companies that trade in it and the vessels that transport it. Another kind of big option out there is this confiscation and transfer of Russian frozen assets. So we've got, last I saw in a Treasury press release was 360 billion around the world. Most of that is in the EU, but 6 billion is in the US. So there, and there was the Repo Act in April 2024 that does give the government the authority to seize the asset and transfer title to to the U.S. government for various sort of Ukraine-related uses. So that's sort of always on the table. That has a lot of complex, impacts on U.S. currency and stuff that we don't want to get into, but it's perhaps in the back of policymakers' minds. And then we could also see a sort of return to Biden era targeting of Russian supply chains, especially in East Asia. So sort of, I think we'll talk about Iran in a minute, but we saw a recent Iran action where they sort of did the traditional go and figure out who's selling the chips, the machine tools, the ball bearings, sort of all that stuff that goes into the Russian war machine, and put 50, 60 to 100 kind of actors on the list, and hope that kind of cuts off the supply to Russia.
No, I mean, all of those are very interesting. I also be interested to see whether or not we wind up coordinating more with the EU as we had done, in the last administration, and it has seemed to start coming back. I mean, President Trump was in Scotland for the last 10 days. It looked like he was having a lot of meetings with European leaders, particularly leaders in the UK. Europeans have already, passed at least one, I think maybe two packages since President Trump took office. The U.S. hasn't really followed suit. And so with respect to, the coordination of sanctions and sanctions policy, it'll be interesting to see whether or not we start to coordinate with the Europeans a little more if this comes to pass in terms of a ratcheting up of U.S. sanctions.
Absolutely. And actually a sort of easy move for the US government would be to just take the actors that the Europeans have already sanctioned, for example, for transshipment, and then put them on our own SDN list, because the homework has already been done. So you can just sort of borrow from it and put them on the list.
Yeah, and one thing to think about in that area is that the Europeans, at least as I understand it, put some of the Indian oil refineries on the list that were purchasing Russian oil, and so that's also, but the U.S. did not, and that is also another potential way that the U.S. could go apart from this secondary tariff concept that's already been discussed in connection with India.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, why don't we turn from Russia, where it sounds like the crystal ball says that things could happen in the next few months, to Iran. I mean, what's happening there? I know that back in, I think it was June, the U.S. and Israel bombed the Iranian nuclear sites to a point where President Trump, I think, said that those sites were obliterated. This was in the context of ongoing discussions about a renewed nuclear deal. Where are we now with that? I mean, what do we think is going to happen in Iran with respect to kind of, on the one hand, a new deal, on the other hand, the sanctions are all still there from the U.S. side and show no signs of letting up?
Yeah. So again, I would say all signs point to more sanctions. It was a sort of interesting space immediately after the bombings, if that sort of changed the incentives of the negotiators in any meaningful way. I think we sort of got the answer to that question this week when we started to see some big sanctions actions on this Wednesday, July 30th, and Thursday, July 31st. That indicate to me that the USG is back to its pressure campaign and SPM2 on Iran. First one was the Shamkhani network, which looks like just a huge package of I think it was more than 50 individuals and entities and more than 50 vessels that were part of a shipping network that Iran was using to sell its hydrocarbons and generate revenue. And then the very next day, July 31st, we saw another big package focused on stuff that goes in to support Iran's UAV drone program. So in this case, I think it was focused on machine tools, which is one of those inputs that Iran, Russia, North Korea, they all rely on foreign machine tools and are always trying to sort of import them for weapons programs. But I think I'm sure that folks in the USG are looking at all the other stuff that Iran imports for its drone program, so chips, ball bearings, stuff like that. And so I think we could continue to see more sanctions both on the revenue side and on the weapons component side.
Yeah, I mean, this has been an ongoing problem. My recollection is at the very beginning of the war, Iran started selling a lot of drones directly to Russia, and I think that essentially the provision in the EAR, Part 746, that relates to Iran, was changed in response to that by having essentially an appendix of items that were EAR 99 that had gone into these drones that would now be subject to licensing requirements, even when sent from non-U.S. companies or countries, which previously did not exist.
Yeah, the supplement 7 to Part 746.8, I believe.
Just a wild guess.
But no, I think that's exactly right. I think I was personally shocked, and I think others were, once we sort of started seeing the debris from Russian, Iranian, and North Korean weapons in Ukraine, there's sort of two interesting facts about it, and all of this is public. You can find this on a Ukrainian government website, but there's very little multilaterally controlled, almost no multilaterally controlled items in these weapon systems, which to me is an interesting indication that, if you put it on the Commerce Control List and it has a 001 or a 002 ECCN, it's probably not going to get to one of these heavily restricted destinations. But just a wealth of 991, 992, or EAR 99 U.S. technology in all of these weapon systems. So very, very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it's a good advertisement for how export controls can work, but maybe it's an advertisement for the fact that maybe not enough things are controlled. All right. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about what's going on with respect to the JCPOA, because that, even though the U.S. pulled out, the JCPOA is still in effect between Europe and Iran. But my understanding is there's some negotiations that are going on, because I think it expires, or at least certain big parts of it expire in 2025. So what's going to happen there, Coleman?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think two sort of public things we've seen that are interesting. The first is we've seen this announcement from the E3. I think it was earlier this week. Maybe even Monday. That reiterating that they will trigger a snapback of UN sanctions if Iran fails to make progress towards a nuclear deal by August 2025.
Which starts today.
Which starts today, yeah. So that is the JCPOA back in the day, 2015 was P5+1, so it was a multilateral affair, U.S. plus the Security Council members, including Russia and China, which is sort of fascinating, and then the EU. And just to see other members of that original P5+1 that we're still sort of friendly with continue to press Iran to finish its nuclear deal is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, that has been a deal that has gone through a lot of peaks and valleys. I mean, by all accounts, it was working in 2018 when the U.S. pulled out. The E3 stayed in. But there wasn't much to it, in the sense that a lot of the bargain had been struck with respect to U.S. sanctions, which had gone back into place, and so it was still a deal, at least with respect to Europe. But it wasn't. It was a shell of a deal, but it was still in place, and it still is in place. So
yeah, no, maybe someday we'll get a former OFACer to come on the pod to talk about the history of the JCPOA, because it is a fascinating history.
I agree.
The other thing.
Go ahead.
No. Please go ahead, Tim.
No, all I was going to say is one of the things about the JC. It's a great idea to have someone from OFAC come on here. OFAC, if you're listening, please think about coming on to talk about the JCPOA, or maybe somebody who was formerly there and involved in the beginning stages of the agreement. But I think the other thing about the JCPOA that's so fascinating is that the theory of sanctions has been that it's designed to change behavior, and the U.S. sanctions were then used as a negotiating tool to change Iranian behavior, which, at least by all accounts, changed over the course of those 3 years, and in a way that was verifiable and still taking place. And so the history of that deal is in part the history of kind of whether sanctions as a form of behavior changing can work, but also there aren't very many other examples besides the JCPOA that I can think of where there was essentially a trade of sanctions for behavioral change in a way that was put into an agreement.
No, I agree with you. There's also a whole fascinating history, related to the sanctions that were put in place on Iran after the hostage crisis in the 80s, and then um, gradually removed as the United States and Iran sort of negotiated their difficulties there. There's a fascinating history of the max pressure 1.0, as I have sometimes heard it called, which is the 2010s stripping cases against banks. So it is a really fascinating history.
All right, we're going to have to do that. Let's put a pin in that and make
okay.
it. We will.
Yeah.
We will circle back to that hopefully soon.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, but the one other small thing I did want to notice here is I have not seen any Iran-related sanctions against European partners, and I haven't seen any rhetoric about sort of against European partners vis-a-vis Iran, which is interesting to me because there has been a lot of, traditionally there was a lot of criticism of Germany, France, sort of others in the EU for continuing to support Iran while the United States was engaging in this max pressure campaign. So the fact that we haven't seen that this time around suggests that there's a greater alignment in policy on Iran than we've seen in many years.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think the E3 development is an example of that because, the negotiations that the E3 are pushing Iran towards are also the same negotiations that the U.S. are pushing, has been pushing Iran towards, and was trying to use as a way to, at least arguably prevent the bombing that took place as to Iran's nuclear facilities. And so, it does seem to me like we're seeing a lot more coordination on Iran in the Trump second term than we saw during the Trump first term, where the EU and the US were pretty much at odds with respect to Iran for all 4 years.
No, absolutely. And you know what may have changed the calculus in the EU was Iran's support for Russia. I think that may have, yeah.
I agree. I think both that and then the human rights issues that came up in Iran with the protest movements and then the crackdown on the protest movements, I think really affected European attitudes towards Iran in a way that really didn't exist during President Trump's first term. All right. Anything else about Iran?
If I often think about what sanctioned country I would most like to visit in a sort of alternative universe where they're not ruled by authoritarian governments, and Iran is right at the top of the list. I would love to visit a free Iran someday. So
yeah, it's such a fascinating place and such a beautiful place. So hopefully the future will bring a different. We will come see a free Iran and an Iran that is living in peace with the rest of its neighbors. All right, let's move to Latin America. Latin America is something that if we were going to talk about it normally in the sanctions context, I don't think we'd be focusing on Mexico. I think we'd be, obviously focusing on Venezuela and Cuba, and then with Rubio as Secretary of State, those would seem to be the obvious choices. But I think today we're probably not going to talk about Venezuela and Cuba much at all. What do you think? Let's talk about Latin America and tell me where you think the hotspots are.
Yeah. No, this is it's been really fascinating to watch this. I agree with you, Tim. I would have predicted, especially with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that we would have had a sort of max pressure campaign on Venezuela and Cuba. And we haven't seen those sanctions let up, but it's not where the kind of energy and focus seems to be. This FTO, TCO, narco program in Mexico and to a lesser extent Colombia and Venezuela has been really interesting to watch. Seems like there's a lot of energy and activity going into, first round was sort of designate all the cartels as FTOs. Second round was designate their associates and front companies. And then I think we've seen these three FinCEN orders identifying certain Mexico-based financial institutions as financial institutions of primary money laundering concern in connection with illicit opioid trafficking. So that's kind of the beginning of stage 3, where I think folks at OFAC and other agencies are looking for, legitimate businesses that are supporting cartel activity. So I think we're going to have a magnifying glass on this space for a while, and it's very interesting to watch.
Yeah, one of the things that has been, very interesting to me about this is that FinCEN has become kind of much more of a prominent enforcement agency than it had been previously. This shouldn't be too surprising in some sense. The head of FinCEN was previously the head of OFAC, and I think that what she brought in terms of moving over to FinCEN was more of an OFAC enforcement-related focus, at least from the outside. That's what it looks like to me. And an enforcement-related focus, particularly with respect to banks, which makes sense because it's FinCEN, but also makes sense because it's OFAC. And, you talked about some of the stripping enforcement actions in the 2010 Collmanns. Those were directed at banks, not just in the U.S., but non-U.S. banks as well, mostly in Europe and the UK. And what those did was give OFAC kind of a lot more visibility into financial transactions than it had previously, because the end product of those enforcement actions was that you had banks that became very focused on compliance and coordination and cooperation with OFAC. And I think to some extent, this move by FinCEN seems a move in a similar direction, albeit, at the early stages, because we've never seen anything like this from FinCEN before.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a sort of more energetic, aggressive FinCEN. It also just makes sense, especially for a jurisdiction like Mexico, which is so closely tied to the United States. An SDN listing, especially of a major bank, would just be hugely disruptive. And so FinCEN has a lot of tools that are, from a USG perspective, they're sort of less disruptive, but they can still send a strong message and change incentives in the region.
What do you see going forward in this area? Do you think it'll grow, or do you think this was kind of the big announcements and the big splash, but then things will calm down in Mexico going forward?
I think we're going to see more of this stuff. I think it's going to be, this may be a bit extreme of a prediction, but I think it's sort of like early days of FCPA, like FCPA in maybe 2008 or something like that. And I just think there's a lot of interest in the USG at kind of going after this problem and doing what they can to cut off revenue streams for the cartels.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that it'll be interesting to watch, but it's certainly a problem that is, if you're serious about tackling it, it's going to take quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of time.
Yeah. The other thing I'll just say that it reminds me of is OFAC's ransomware advisory, which I think was 2020.
Yes.
Which essentially staked out the position that a payment to a sanctioned ransomware bad actor, I'm not sure exactly what the term is, could be a sanctions violation. And so it really sort of forced companies to rethink, we're being extorted by these ransomware bad actors, but can we really make the payment? So.
Yeah, and I will say that pretty soon after that announcement, I was getting quite a few calls and inquiries from companies that were in exactly that position. They'd been the subject of a ransomware attack, being asked to make a payment, and started to think about sanctions in connection with that payment in a way that before the announcement, I don't think I got any of those calls.
Do you want to talk in the Latin American space about the Brazilian judge, Alexander de Moraes?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because Brazil is not a place where normally we would be talking about having a sanctions conversation. I don't think that this might be a first on Embargoed where we're talking about Brazil in connection with sanctions, but when was it, about a week ago, the U.S. put a justice on the Brazilian Supreme Court, Alexandre de Moraes, on the SDN list. Why don't you talk a little bit about that designation, Coleman?
Yeah, so that's obviously a highly political, or I guess the way I would say it is that a designation of that that impactful, I'm sure, had sign off from high levels within the U.S. government. I think sort of on the more technical side, what was interesting to me was the authority that they used. So these are global Magnitsky human rights sanctions, and the legal standard for this is something called serious human rights abuse, SHRA. And so that's the statutory language here is extrajudicial killings, torture, or other gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. So there was kind of this long, interesting debate within the human rights community about whether that was the right standard to sanction somebody. There's like one conversation that I've heard among NGOs was when the Taliban retook Kabul, can we sanction some Talibs under global Magnitsky? And the issue is that discrimination against women, as egregious as it is, it's not clear that it rises to the level of extrajudicial killings, torture, or other gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. So then to see this sanctions against this Supreme Court justice, and then to look at the OFAC press release, and sort of the activity that the allegations in that press release is pretty interesting, and it to me it does seem like a sort of different standard for SHRA than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I totally agree. I thought that it was interesting that these were GLOMAG sanctions, as opposed to kind of going on the path that the president has gone down when he's imposed sanctions against the International Criminal Court, where you essentially do an executive order, essentially delegate to OFAC the power to impose sanctions in certain circumstances, and don't try to tie them so closely to international human rights violations, but instead kind of tie them to the unique type of emergency that the president perceives. So I thought that was very interesting, because they didn't seem to fit neatly into the GLOMAG box. But
I agree, and this is also a little bit kind of inside baseball, but the ICC sanctions that you just mentioned, the executive order, I believe it gives the Secretary of State the primary designation authority, which is so then you have an agency with political leadership at the top sort of making the decision. But GLOMAG is traditionally a Treasury designation authority, and the director of OFAC is a civil servant. So it's interesting that that's just another sort of nuance I think is interesting.
No, but I'm looking at the GLOMAG order. It's the Secretary of State has the power in consultation with the Secretary of Treasury and Attorney General, not the GLOMAG, the ICC order. And
yeah.
The ICC order, it gives that power to the Secretary of State, which again, I agree, this designation, is essentially of the Brazilian Supreme Court justice is essentially a foreign policy designation, and you'd think that that would be one where you'd kind of follow the path that we've done with other types of foreign policy designations, like the ICC designation. But
Yeah. And then just one other quick issue on Brazilian judges and sort of impacts on U.S. persons. I think overall this is not going to be super impactful on U.S. persons. I'm not sure how many assets of this sanctioned judge are in the United States, but it does remind me of the 2020 designations of judges in Venezuela. So we saw Venezuelan judges involved in human rights abuses. The Citgo Six was some political prisoners. And I think we saw this at the firm, Tim. It creates this issue for U.S. companies that have litigation in front of a Venezuelan judge, especially since the judge is sanctioned and they don't really have control over it. So that's an issue that I could see popping up in Brazil.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and other type issues like, to the extent that the judge wants to transact in U.S. dollars. That's another type of issue that can come up. You would think. Don't know what the judge's financial situation is, but to the extent that the judge owns companies, those companies could be problematic. A few years ago, we saw the former president of Paraguay subject to actually global Magnitsky sanctions, and I was actually surprised at the number of companies that former president owned in Paraguay, because we were getting repeated questions after those sanctions went into place about dealings with those companies. So I don't know if that's going to be another potential consequence of this, but certainly for a judge and a judge in a country where the U.S. has considerable interaction, unlike Venezuela or Iran. I think we may have put some judges in Iran on the SDN list as well, but the occasions in which a U.S. person or a U.S. company would be involved in proceedings before a judge in Iran or Venezuela are pretty limited. Brazil is a different story, and so I can see this issue coming up more frequently in Brazil, and one in which you have to have a lot of sympathy for the U.S. companies that are in this position, because you don't get to pick your judge.
Yeah.
And once your judge has been picked, you don't have a lot of control about your ability to just say no thanks to the proceedings, right? So these are not voluntary proceedings by any sense of the imagination, but I think OFAC would take the position that the judge is providing services to the U.S. company by acting as a judge, and you can't take any services from an SDN, so you'd need a license from OFAC in order to do that. And so I think that creates a situation that theoretically arose in Venezuela, and probably did in a few instances in the same way theoretically could arise in other places like Iran, where judges have been subject to sanctions, but the chances of that happening are pretty slim, or it's probably few and far between. But in Brazil, I think it could be a big deal. All right. Well, enough about sanctions. What do we see happening in export controls? What's our crystal ball say about chips, China, and maybe we'll talk at the end about BIS and the 50% rule.
Yeah. So lots of interesting developments in the sort of export control space, especially in these these AI chips and the hardware that incorporates these AI chips. It seems to me it's one of those kind of classic export control dilemmas where the USG wants U.S. companies to sell the stuff, increase exports, revenue, profits, but at the same time doesn't want to see the stuff end up in an adversary's weapon system or used to build an adversary's weapon system. So that's always a tough call to make for a policymaker. Sort of where do you draw that line? So I think there's and I Godspeed, but I think they're trying to sort of figure out where that line is. We had the announcement that they weren't going to enforce the Biden era AI diffusion rule, which was what they called a worldwide licensing requirement on high-end AI chips, but then license exceptions that allow trade in certain instances. So that's been rescinded. So we're still sort of waiting to see what will come out of that. And we've seen a couple of kind of breadcrumbs of what that might look like. The first that is interesting to me is, we've seen some news about sales of AI chips to the UAE and even to China.
A lot of news about both of those. I mean, I think the UAE one was in connection with President Trump's visit to the UAE.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese one has been in connection with President Trump's meeting with the head of NVIDIA, at least as I think I saw some of the reports.
Yeah. But so what was interesting to me about both of those is not that they, I didn't see any indications that they were removing the controls themselves, but instead they were saying, they were promising at least to keep the controls in place, but license against the controls. So, we'll sell you the chips, but you still have to come in for a license, which is pretty interesting. It does, it has sort of two benefits and a drawback from the USG perspective. The benefits are the USG gets a lot more visibility into the transaction. They see the consignee, they see the end user, they see the intermediaries, they see any information that they ask for from the applicants and for the license. And then it also gives them sort of more leverage over U.S. companies and foreign customers, because if you don't, if you break the rules somewhere else, then you're less likely to get your license. Even if you're, interestingly enough, a purchaser of these chips in the UAE or China, you now have to sort of engage with the USG to get the chips. The drawback is, go ahead, Tim.
No. So I was just gonna chime in on this idea that I love the idea of licensing in theory, because I actually think it helps companies as well, because I think the licensing process will focus everyone in on the idea that the U.S. government views making sure these particular items, get to the end user that is allowed and nowhere else. And so it should hone companies in on those requirements, because that's what the licensing process is going to focus on.
Yeah.
But I think you're going to get to what I think is also the dilemma. But let's hear you go first. What's the downside of this?
So from the USG perspective, the downside is you basically take the risk of something going wrong onto yourself. So if you're the licensing officer, so one, you have to have enough licensing officers to look.
Well, to me, that's my big dilemma is, once you add licensing into the process, you need to be prepared to deal with all the licenses in a comprehensive way.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But if you're not, then you run into one of two problems. And I think one problem that I'd be, concerned about at the outset is delay. But I think the other problem is the one that you're talking about, Coleman, which is you take on the risk, but there's all this pressure to go fast. And so if taking on the risk is probably worth it if you're convinced you can do it well.
Well, I think consistent with our shout out at the beginning of the pod to our USG listeners, in particular, a shout out to the USG licensing officers out there. This stuff is complicated. And when the government sort of makes foreign companies, or not foreign companies, all companies sort of figure it out, then the risk of missing something, that falls on the company. But then if you sort of take it in-house from the government's perspective and you have your licensing officers do it, and, it's easy to miss this stuff. The bad actors lie,
that is the problem for everyone, right?
Yeah. And so then if you're, if you're a licensing officer or the supervisor of a licensing officer, and you kind of miss something like this, that could be a big deal. And then there's always this pressure, especially for high value exports like these AI chips, to sort of get it done quickly. So maybe in a perfect world, I agree with you, Tim. I think if I were sort of president of sanctions and export controls, I would say I would have a licensing requirement for more stuff, but then I would sort of adequately staff the government to sort of take on the burden of this. And the other thing I'll say is that the government knows a lot more than the companies.
That's exactly part of the reason that I really like the government in the process, is because it does know much more than the companies. The company's ability to do this sort of due diligence, particularly in this area that you'd need to do to really get it right, is very limited. Even if you have everybody in place that are kind of professional export control people, when you don't have that, which you pretty much don't, then you have companies doing this due diligence, if they do it at all, because a lot of them just don't know to do it. And so having a licensing requirement would essentially force the companies to understand that these licensing requirements exist and that you have to follow them in order to do these. Like if everything required a license, then the companies would at least understand that, and then would be forced into a process that would ensure some level of compliance, that when it's all on your own, you just have actors out there that are just new to the field that just don't get this, just don't get that it can be pretty hard. And so you'd have some uniform level of compliance. But it only works if there's enough licensing officers to be able to do it relatively quickly. Because if this just becomes a roadblock, then it's going to be the worst of all worlds, because you're going to have, you're going to kill U.S. business, and you're still not going to be like, I guess you'll be preventing diversion, but you'll be preventing it in a way that is unsustainable. I mean, at some point, you'd have this kind of pushback, and the pushback would probably go to a level where the export controls would be relaxed, as opposed to same export controls, but just better and quicker licensing.
No, I think that's exactly right. But
so we've solved it. We've solved it. We're done. Just more licensing officers, and it's all done.
Well, but I mean, I do think, it is sort of kudos where kudos is due. I think sort of keeping the licensing requirements on these chips and hardware, especially for UAE and China, makes a lot of sense to me. But step 2 is hire more licensing officers. The other interesting thing I noticed was this announcement in mid-July that Malaysia said it would start controls on US AI chips. And to me, that's, we've seen these this testimony from the current undersecretary of BIS, Jeffrey Kessler, that the U.S. intends to press allies and partners to align controls. So I suspect that this Malaysia control is part of a sort of a deal that we'll see in the in the replacement to the AI diffusion rule, sort of removing controls on Malaysia in exchange for Malaysia implementing their own controls. And so how that plays out for, Chinese data centers who are setting up shop in Malaysia will be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, it really will. And since you mentioned Jeffrey Kessler, and I think I guess it's Landon Hyde who has testified about this, but BIS there's been a lot of talk at BIS about moving to the 50% rule that OFAC has in connection with sanctions. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, we've seen reports from Export Compliance Daily and others about a sort of, and then Landon, I think the nominee, the President Trump's nominee for Assistant Secretary for Export Administration, was talking about the idea of, so just backing up a little bit to be a little bit of sort of technical sanctions and export controls. Under the sanctions program, if you're on the SDN list, all companies that you own 50% or more are automatically blocked, i.e. sanctioned, even if they don't appear on the list separately. So, you sanction a Russian oligarch, and then all of his companies are sanctioned as well, even if they're not on the list. The BIS entity list, which is the BIS list-based tool, does not work that way. It applies the end user prohibitions apply only to the listed entity itself. So, for example, you can't sell to Huawei, but if there's a subsidiary of Huawei and it's not separately added to the entity list, you can sell to the subsidiary. Apologies for that, Tim, but I hope
No,
that's
I think
helpful.
that's worth being very clear about, because that has been a huge difference between an OFAC list and a BIS list, and one that I think that, at least in my experience, clients see a BIS listing, they just assume a 50% rule applies until advised otherwise. And so we've given a lot
Yes.
of advice otherwise, and then added in the caveat that BIS always adds in, that it's kind of a red flag if the
Yes.
parent is on a list and the sub isn't, that you have to make sure that the sub is buying for itself and not essentially just acting as a procuring agent for the parent to get her to essentially evade the entity listing on the parent through the subsidiary purchasing it, and to watch for other things. But essentially, you need to exercise extra diligence when you've got a related party on the entity list. But it's not an automatic prohibition like it is for OFAC, where the list is on there. And the OFAC list, the way that the 50% rule works, creates a lot of issues with respect to, like, companies try to do compliance by looking on the list, and that's not easy, but at least it's easy to describe and to describe a process. But when you start bringing in the 50% rule, it creates a lot more complexity, because you don't just need to figure out whether the company you're dealing with is on the list. You have to figure out who all the owners are, and then figure out what the ownership percentage is, which makes it a lot harder.
Yes. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think you can sort of see from the U.S. government perspective, cutting down diversion, cutting down loopholes, why you would be interested in a BIS 50% rule. I suspect, and I should say, just everything I've said today has been just purely my speculation. But I suspect, as they're sort of thinking through how do you impose a 50% rule on entity listed entities, the issue is, OFAC has been operating with a 50% rule for 10 years now. So when they put a company on the list, they know, this is going to impact all the subsidiaries. They know sort of how to figure out who the subsidiaries are. They know how to carve out subsidiaries when they need to. Let's say they play a crucial role in world aluminum supply chains or something like that. Whereas BIS, previously they've been able to put entities on the list and they haven't had to worry about that, because you could still legally sell to the subsidiary. But so now, if you go back retroactively and apply the 50% rule, I mean, there's some huge companies on the BIS entity list, because that was the way the tool was designed to be used. It was like you could put a big company on the list, and you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about this, huge implications for U.S. exporters. But the example that I think of is Inspur, which is just a huge Chinese cloud computing company. And are you really going to put hundreds of Inspurs of subsidiaries on the entity list all of a sudden? That's a huge export control action. And so I think they're sort of trying to think through exactly how that's going to play out.
Yeah, I mean, that is the thing, is that it results in the automatic listing of thousands of companies. And before you do that, you're going to want to figure out who are these companies and how that is going to affect, certainly not just the U.S. supply chain system, but all of our allies as well. Because in 2018, you mentioned the effects of the 50% rule, and particularly on the aluminum industry. When OFAC put Deripaska on the SDN list, it wasn't clear to me that they'd thought through how that was going to affect Rusal at the time of the listing. And that listing came up pretty fast because I think there was a required oligarch list from CATSA, and Secretary Mnuchin went and testified in front of Congress, and there was a lot of political pressure on him to start listing oligarchs. And so a month later, he promised during the hearing he would, and a month later, Deripaska went on the list. And then all of a sudden, the aluminum market started to crash, and so there was a long series of negotiations dealing with Rusal and a lot of essentially general licenses that suspended application of the 50% rule with respect to Rusal. And so it was just with one company. The effect of the 50% rule was chaos in a pretty big sector of, a pretty big sector and pretty important sector worldwide. And so here you'd be, you'd basically be doing it blind. At least with Deripaska, there was some ability to think about that when they listed him. But here it's basically like we've got a lot of companies on the entity list, and now their subsidiaries aren't sanctioned or aren't subject to the entity list rule. So,
it really is. There could be dozens of Rusals sort of on the entity list. If you sort of automatically applied this rule. So
right, and ones where where we haven't thought about them in years, right? I mean, this is an issue that wasn't considered at the time of the listing, and some of these listings could be 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and so you got to go back and figure out for all of these listings. Okay, now that we adopt the 50% rule, what does this mean? Who are we adding to the list without even knowing it?
Yeah, no, it's a challenge, and so I do have a little bit of speculation about how they might do it. First could be a new footnote. Which I think there's not a lot of enthusiasm for footnotes in industry.
It does make compliance really hard when the key doctrine is all in a footnote, but they've done it before, so it won't surprise me.
But that's what they've done before, when they wanted to apply the foreign direct product rule to a specific entity. It's almost turning into the OFAC tag system, basically. But they could have a footnote 7. I don't know what we're up to yet, but footnote 7 that, entities that are 50% or more owned by this entity are also automatically blocked.
So it's basically an opt-in. The normal rule, the current rule stays, but it can be overridden by a footnote in the entity list. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And then they could go back retroactively if they wanted to and add, they could put the footnote on entities that have been on the entity list for a while.
But it allows them to go back and do this in kind of a considered process, as opposed to just, as soon as they pass the rule, it automatically applies to every entity on the entity list.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Yeah. That's actually really my only idea of how they could possibly do it. I mean, the other thing they could do is they could do just a mega entity list package, 10,000 entities, subsidiaries of bad actors, but that doesn't even really get at the problem. I mean, the huge problem from the USG perspective is that it's really easy for a listed entity to just set up a sub, No, and we haven't talked about this yet, but that's really what drives the 50% rule. We feel comfortable that we could probably list every company we want listed now, but 10 days from now, after we do the listing, there would be new companies that we didn't catch, and we'd have to go put them on the list as well. And so we can't make a list that will essentially prevent that going forward. And so we're just going to have this 50% rule, which means we don't have to continue to do new listings. And that makes some sense, but it only makes sense if when you do at the time of the listing that one of the consequences is going to be that the subsidiaries are listed as well. And we have all these other listings where the express consideration was we're listing you but not your subsidiaries, and to apply that rule retroactively creates some issues that wouldn't exist going forward.
I mean, they could, I guess the other alternative is that they could make it prospective only, like listings as of, August 2nd, 2025, are accompanied by the 50% rule. But the problem from a compliance perspective is you'd have to have some way of being able to figure that out, short of forcing the company to go look at the date of the listing for every listing to know what it means.
The footnote to me, that sounds like a footnote. Yeah.
Yeah. It sounds like a footnote, right? I mean, that's the problem, is that to make it it just prospective, which would be, I think, the right move, and then allow BIS the authority to go back and do retroactive designations for others, is going to require some sort of notation, and I think you're getting at a footnote. And if it were if it were footnote 1, I think everybody would be very comfortable with it because it's pretty simple. But because of all of the footnotes in connection with the foreign direct product rule and all the complexity that's added, and then plus all the other foreign direct product rules that have arisen around the same time, so now we're up to like 14 foreign direct product rules, I think people just associate all those footnotes with extreme complexity in terms of compliance.
The other thought that just occurred to me is the other way that OFAC deals with this is through general licenses. So they can, if they sanction a big, Russian conglomerate, but there's still a part of it that, provides a key input into Europe's industrial base, they can issue a general license that carves out, certain subsidiaries or carves out certain products. And, the BIS license exception structure doesn't really work for company-specific general licenses. There have been I think there's been one BIS general license related to Huawei.
I remember that when it came out. It might have even, was it the standards-related activity? I can't remember what it was, but it related to Huawei.
That's a good question. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think if they were going to start doing entity listings that had an automatic 50% rule, they would need to have some sort of general license-like mechanism to carve out activity that we would want to see continue.
All right. Well, I think we've gone as far as we're going to go in terms of solving the 50% issue today. Any final words from your crystal ball, Coleman?
No, I mean, we'll see. This all could be totally wrong.
It's the beauty. It also could be totally right. You just never know.
Yeah, we'll see.
I think we probably got a lot of stuff right, but I'm open to the possibility that we also got a few things wrong. But thanks for coming on, and it was fun talking.
Yeah, take care. Thanks, everybody.
Stay sanctions free, everyone.
Produced by Heartcast Media.